So those of you that don't already know me, I think everybody here knows me now, maybe. I'm James. I work for currently setting up a company, but I have a long-standing background in audio, working in the music industry for many years. So I'm actually going to do the opposite of what most people do. I'm going to keep this really short. And I figure you guys can ask me a lot of questions at the end, and you can get to know what you actually want to know, rather than me telling you a lot of information that you probably may not necessarily need to know. So yeah, this is a very quick overview of audio in general. Two main types of audio, for those of you that don't know, mono and stereo. So mono is a single point of audio, which is effectively like listening to a single speaker. So if you're wandering around with a headphone in, as in like one earbud, that is mono. Stereo, you've got both, so you've got the adaptation between left and right, and the differences between that. A few different formats. WAV is the most widely used, and probably the one that you guys have all used for your game stuff, I kind of hope anyway. It is a larger file size, but it is by far the best quality, and you can port it to pretty much everything. There is almost nothing that WAV isn't supported in. MP3 is good, but if you're doing game stuff, you want to be really careful. MP3s are fine for very small effects, and anything that's quite high in register. But if you're looking at doing things like footsteps or any kind of low tones, don't use MP3. As soon as somebody listens to it on a nice quality system, it will sound terrible. OGG is currently trying to be pushed for a format at the moment. It's been going for a while, but it isn't really widely adopted yet. But it will probably overtake WAV in its usefulness at some point, so it's worth having it in your mind. When it comes to designing audio for games, I don't know how many of you have done it from a kind of designer's perspective. Usually, I know that when I was taught it, it was literally just use this from here, and it'll sound like this, and just put it in there and it'll be fine. And it doesn't really work like that. It is actually more of an art form in itself. So usually the four kind of stages that I go through if I was going to design a piece of audio for someone would be this. So you go through the concept of their game, not necessarily in any great detail, but get the overall concept. So how fast paced is it? Are they making a first person shooter? Are they going to be running around? Is it supposed to be adrenaline fueled? Are you making the next Skyrim? So is it quite slow and you've just got to wander around? Again, adventure FPS. All of that will make a difference to the sound that you end up creating. Art style is a huge one to convey into what you're going to end up making. So when I did a bit of work for another company down in Cornwall, they have a tower defense game, which was basically a 2D fighting game. And their art style was very pixelated. Now, in terms of music, that immediately rules out everything that you want to do with a big orchestra. Because if you've got a really pixelated, old, retro art style, and you're putting really modern, nice, huge, great symphonic orchestra sounds over it, it doesn't work. Even from an outside user's perspective, they won't feel comfortable with it because it doesn't fit with the overall genre. And even things like 2D and 3D will make a difference. So if you've got a 2D only game, again, you don't want to be going into really rich sounds. They're not really expecting rich sounds from a 2D game because the level of realism isn't there. You can physically see that it isn't. Whereas if you've got a 3D environment, you need to make sure that your audio is up to scratch. So you need a very full-bodied sound, more likely about 100 sounds in various different spots. Make sure that you're covering all your bases from a 3D point of view. But it gives you a much richer sound, and that is a lot more believable to a user or a gamer than having your little 8-bit track playing on a lovely 3D environment. Doesn't really fit. Length. This is interesting because I'm probably one of the few people that looks at it this way. The other guys that I speak to look at it in terms of the whole game as a section. I don't. I tend to split it into its various different bits. So when I'm looking at a game start writing music for it, it's more a case of you look at their intro sequence and their trailer. You would then maybe look at their menu screens, and then start building up a list of effects that they might want within those menu scenes. So do they want a noise when they're hovering over certain things with a mouse, or whatever they happen to be doing, if it's VR or not. And I tend to build it up in sections because it keeps the differentiation between each separate bit. A lot of other guys will try and do it as a whole thing. So they will get your whole game and write an entire score for the whole thing, which again can work, it depends on the game, but it's easier, especially if you're just kind of starting into getting into the audio side, to break it up into its separate bits. Looping is a big one, because in terms of being an audio engineer for a game, loops are your best friend in the world. Because if you can make a nice repetitive loop that doesn't get boring quickly, that saved you creating another 20 minutes worth of that particular sample, and you can just loop it, make it sound nice and set in, and not have to worry about it. And lastly, focus. So what's the game about? Again, kind of goes back to concept, but in a little bit more detail. So if you're looking at it in terms of what they actually really want from it, so if they are making a Skyrim game, is it outside of the mountains? Or are you going to be just in little villages? Are you underwater? In space? All of those things make a difference to the sounds and instruments that you can use to make it a little bit more believable. So in a little bit more detail, as I say, I'm probably one of the few people that splits it into different bits. But if you don't find this easy, that's fine, you can do it as a whole thing, it doesn't really matter, most people usually do. So when you're thinking of like a theme tune or a song, again, coming from the concept point, is very important to try and keep in mind the characteristics of what they're going for. So if you're going to write a theme tune for a song, make sure that it builds with the game. A lot of people do actually write the theme tune for the first level and then port it back over the intro of the game, because usually the first level of the game introduces the core mechanics, so you've got your separate parts that you're trying to teach the player. If you can bring the music in to reflect that, you're then just empowering the users to feel a little bit more involved, and it's all a nicer package. 90% of the time you can use that first level of music to create your theme tune for the game, because that's the first thing they hear anyway. So you want to create that nice uniform sound for the whole game. Again, one long loop, usually for a first level, because you want to keep that continuity, but it's always going to be building. So it'll change. There are various different ways that we can go through that. Some of them are speed, some of them are adding more instruments. Really depends on the sound of the game that you're going for. And then importance within the scene. And this is one that I noticed last year, because again, when we were doing game stuff here, we were said, you just use these samples, put them into these specific places, and your game will sound like this. Which is fine, it does its job, but there's a real thing you need to be wary of. I came across one with narration in, and if you've ever tried making a soundtrack with somebody narrating over it, it really, really limits the sounds that you can use. Because the human voice is great at interpreting a lot of sounds, but the problem with that is it also covers a massive register. So as I'm speaking now, there was maybe 3 or 4 instruments that I physically couldn't use to go alongside my voice, because they would just cut me out completely in terms of frequency and where it sits within the game. So if you know that there is narration going on, try and get it before you start writing your music. Because again, a female narrator will have a different pitch to a male narrator. Focus of the game might be very different, so if it's quite a childish, bouncy, happy game, their frequency of their voice will make a difference. It's really important to understand where the music's focus is within that game environment and its level of prominence in it. And the same goes for in-game. However, you've then got to also consider the effects that are going on with it. So if your character, for instance, is in a really rich 3D world, maybe you're doing like a Western game and you want to try and make sure that the footsteps along the pieces of wood really stand out, you can't make your theme tune, if you've got a backing track behind it, overcome those frequencies that you're using for those footsteps. And a footstep is a really deep sound. So if you're going to do those kind of things, you want to make sure that the instruments that you're using are very light. It's very, very bad idea usually if you're having a constant sound like a footstep to include drums in your soundtrack, because rhythm is one thing that will always throw everybody off. So if you're listening to a piece of music, for instance, and you tap your foot along to it, which most people do, I do, and you then start tapping your foot out of time, or you see somebody that's tapping to something else completely and it's in a different time, it's really uncomfortable. And that's glaringly obvious when you start writing music. So if, for instance, you have got your player walking through this salon in a nice dusty desert, so you'll have a lot of reverb. I'll go through effects and stuff in a bit. And you've got a lot of reverb and things on his footsteps to really make them stand out and give him that kind of sense of he's in an open space in a bit of a ghost town. Then you're probably going to use instruments like a cello and a violin, because they're very high pitched in register, but they're quite soothing. They're not prominent, so they're not going to make any sharp sounds that are going to overload those footsteps. There's a lot that you need to consider when you're balancing the sounds that you're using, is kind of the general gist of this. But yeah, that's probably enough of that for me, I think. I've probably bored everybody. Cool. So again, going back to the whole 2D, 3D stuff, flat makes a very big difference in terms of glossy. So if you've got a very flat looking game, 2D, maybe you're using a lot of paper-like textures, for instance, then you're not going to be wanting to using things like huge great drum kits and having a metal band playing in the background, because if you've got a lot of quite soothing, calming colours and textures in your game, you don't want the music not to reflect that. It would just be weird if you had Pantera along to, you know, Super Mario, I guess, but even that's probably a little bit bright. What's a good example?
Faraway?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you know, if you had something like that, it's just it's uncomfortable. So it's something that you need to consider. Again, glossy is usually considered to be a rich environment. So you do have glossy 2D games, but if you're using glossy if glossy is within the art style, you want to be using a lot more high-pitched registers. So you're using things like cymbals, you'll be using flutes perhaps, maybe guitar, those kind of instruments, because they will sit on a glossy surface nice and well, because they resonate naturally as an instrument, as a sound. So does everybody know what I mean by resonate, by the way?
If we don't, explain.
Okay, so if you don't know what I know by resonate, this room is quite good for being dead, but if I clap and you hear an echo after it, you can kind of hear it dissipate out. That's its resonance. So as a clap, that resonated quite well in this room. It spread, had a nice kind of echo and trail off after it. If it wasn't going to be resonated, how am I going to do this? It's probably better, but it shouldn't travel as far, basically. Your resonance is how long your sound will travel after its initial impact. So that's better. So that, in terms of a clap, for instance, that doesn't really travel anywhere. That travels much further. So that's what I meant by resonance. You want to be using a lot of spatial sounds. Colour is a weird one. It depends on the art style they've gone for. So again, if you've got a lot of pastel colours, try and keep it quite calm, quite mellow. If you've got a lot of very bright, vibrant colours, likelihood is it's going to be quite a bright, vibrant game, so you're going to be wanting using more energetic sounds. Probably going to be using drum kits, probably going to be using things like actual band theme tunes, for instance, because they're going to give you that kind of energy that goes along with the sounds. Effects is a huge topic, and I will cover it very briefly, but effects in the audio world is actually usually called Foley, because it's for recreating sounds without necessarily recreating the exact sound. So usually when you hear a footstep in a game, the likelihood is that was never a footstep to start with. When I went to go and speak to a couple of guys that were doing sound for a musical, I think, they were overlaying effects in their musical bit. One of theirs was footsteps, and they made their footsteps with two separate bits. I haven't got a ruler typically, but they started their footstep as a. That was their initial recording of a footstep, and they then overlaid that with various different layers. So you start with your very basic sound of a heel and toe hitting, and then you would build on that because you want a real depth. Personally, if we go back to the whole Western thing, you want a really deep sounding footstep because you want the player to feel really weighty, and you want it to be a very kind of consciously closed scene. So you would add a lot of deep tones to it. So you would probably actually overlay something like a kick drum when the heel is going down, so you get a real thump when they're putting their foot down, and then maybe a slightly lighter, probably a snare drum or a tom underlaid underneath the toe hit, because you're then getting the depth of the noise without having to try and recreate a footstep. I don't know if you've ever tried actually trying to record something that you think is a sound, like lighting a match. If you ever try and record that, you will never ever get it sounding like it sounds to you. And it's the same when people record their voice. I don't know if anyone's recorded their voice, I know a few, yeah. Your voice doesn't sound anything like you think it does, because the way that you hear it and the way that it actually travels into your head is very different. And effects are exactly the same, so you don't hear the sounds that you expect to hear. Again, I'd go back to the footstep one. It also has a very high click, so depending on the type of shoes they're wearing, if you wanted them to have a very formal shoe, if it was a lady in stilettos for instance, or maybe a bloke, depending on the game, then when they're putting their heel down, it's a very, very, very high pitched sound, because it's a very sharp, and usually if you're doing a formal dressing, it's going to be on a hard floor. So that might sound better actually. Is probably going to be your start point for their heel hitting the floor, because you've got a very sharp, quite high pitched sound. That would probably be quite useful for somebody stepping on marble perhaps, because you've got that kind of glossy surface and you get the right refraction for it. But it's all about faking it, because that's what audio is. We don't do anything real anymore. I can rattle on about effects later on, if you guys want to ask questions about it later, but I will leave it there for now, because I will try and keep this fairly short. Animations, smooth and robotic. Again, that makes a difference to the kind of sounds that you're going to create. If you've got very smooth rolling animations, for instance, maybe you're doing a cutscene perhaps in Skyrim, unless their frame rate was horrendous. And you want the music to reflect that, so you'd have quite a soft music, it would be gentle, there'd be no real sharp sounds to it. You'd probably slowly layer up your sounds so that it built gradually rather than being a very sharp cut. Unless, of course, you've got something dramatic that's about to happen, and they're about to fall off a cliff or whatever. And the opposite goes for robotic. So if you're making the next Sonic the Hedgehog, then you want very sharp, stabby sounds, because it's a very fast-paced game with a lot of very sudden changes. So you're bouncing around all over the place. The music needs to reflect that. You need to make sure that they are the same thing. And again, the cutscenes kind of goes back to animation. It's making sure that whatever you're writing fits within whatever you're actually seeing. Would you like me to go into this bit in a bit more depth? Because this is actually a bit personal to me and not generally how the rest of the world does it.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah? Okay. So, how long are games intended to be played? This makes a difference when you're trying to do things like looping. So if you've got a game that you are intending them to be playing for 5 hours, you are not going to want to be putting loops in there, because they're going to get pissed off with that sound going over and over and over again. So you know then that if your game is probably anything more than probably 2 minutes, you want to try and avoid looping too much, unless it's in things like menu scenes when your music shouldn't be too prominent anyway. Repetition is horrible. Although I don't know how many of you pick up on it, but when you're playing a game, I know, for instance, if I'm playing a game on my phone, because mobile games are horrendous for it, that you just get the same sound over and over again. It's usually about a 5-second clip. And for mobile games, it's fine, because you're not really expected to play them for more than 2 minutes. So if the music's really irritating, doesn't matter. You're going to put it down in 2 minutes anyway and go off and do something else. But yeah, if you're playing 4 hours of Call of Duty or whatever you happen to be playing, you don't want to be hearing the same do-do-do-do-do-do tune all the way through. How many Foley samples are there? Effects. Again, I put it in brackets because they're effectively the same thing to everybody except an audio engineer. This is, again, comes down to frequencies, so footstep is always an easy go-to. Just make sure that whatever you're going to do with your tune is not going to interact with those sounds. Because you want them to stand out. There's no point in making an effect that's going to be hidden. Even if it's something as boring as you're walking through an industrial house for your scene and there's a turbine in the next room, you want to be able to hear that turbine because that's a really nice piece of atmosphere. But what you don't want to do is you want to have your in-game music completely drown out that sound, because otherwise there's no point in putting it in there. So the sounds, that the effects are usually what dictate the music that can go into a game. I have found a couple of samples of terrible uses of audio and good uses of audio, which I'll share at the end. And again, the length dictates really whether there's a possibility of any kind of looping to do. So when you're going through and trying to plan out a game, again, for me, I do it in sections, so I would look at the trailer in the first level as my go-to inspiration for creating the initial game theme. Menu titles would then be created after that because I know roughly what kind of sounds and instruments I could use. You usually then go down the route of getting a list of all of the effects that you've got. So you get an entire list from the developer, for instance, saying, right, okay, I need a footstep, I need a gunshot, I need 17 different gunshots because there are going to be 17 different guns and they all need to sound different. I need reload noises, I need clothes swishing, I need bombs dropping, well, you know, we're just picking up a load of effects. But you should get a list of that from any developer that's asking you to do audio anyway. Those are your next item on your list because as annoying and as small as they are, they take the longest time to do. Because building one effect can take a day, depending on the quality that they want from it and what that actual effect is. So if you're trying to get a reload sound, the most effective reload sounds that I've heard so far was somebody recording somebody opening a Coke can. And that was used for, what was that? I can't remember what it was used for now. I think it was the same, the musical guys that I was speaking to. But they had a little reload animation that they built from somebody opening a Coke can. So they went like, and then turned that into their cocking an automatic rifle. Because the length of the sound was right and it had the right sharpness at the start for the initial catch and it had the slide sound for the rest of it. The likelihood is, as an audio engineer, no one's going to let you anywhere near a rifle, so you're never going to be able to record an actual one to test it against. Again, it's all about trying to figure out how you can fake it, as with everything in games, as realistically as possible. Yeah. So again, this comes down actually more to effects than your game audio. So fast and slow paced is usually to do with your actual overall theme, which I've banged on about enough now, so I'm not going to go anymore. But game setting makes a huge difference to the effects that you use. So if you've got a game that's indoors, all of your sounds will need a certain amount of reverb. Have you all come across reverb? Yeah? one of the things that winds me up as an audio engineer is the people that don't know the difference between a reverb and a delay. And a lot of people use a delay instead of a reverb. They may sound quite similar, but they are very, very different in terms of their audio space and what they use as their register. So a reverb, we usually use a very, very low setting. So if you want to add some depth and air to your sound, a reverb is always your go-to as an effect. And the size of your room depends on the size of the reverb that you want. In fact, I will. No, I'll do that later. I will get up a couple of samples and I'll show you exactly the difference between what a reverb does and what a delay does, if you're interested, because I know some of you have got to run off too. I'll go through that again later, but a reverb gives real air and density to your sound. So again, a bit like resonance, it is really important to create that atmosphere. So if you're inside a room, then you can hear probably my voice echoing a little bit off these walls, if you're listening particularly closely, don't worry, but if you're listening particularly closely. If I'm outside, my voice would sound really different to where you're sat now. And that's to do with reverb, because that's my sound bouncing off these various different walls, and it's hitting you a certain amount of time after it's coming out of my mouth. When I'm outside, that sound only ever hits you once. So it travels out of my mouth and into your ears. When we're in here, it's travelling out of my mouth into your ears and then hitting all the walls and coming into your ears again, which is why there's a mild delay and why you get that sort of short echo on the end of everything. That gives you your air, if you like, for your sounds. So when you're walking around the room and you want to do footsteps, the easiest one, sorry, then your reverb will give you the size of that room. You can make somebody walk down a narrow corridor by just adjusting the amount of reverb that you put on that sample. Or you can make somebody walk through a woods and take the reverb off pretty much altogether and deaden the sound. But game setting, you want to make sure that whatever you use for your room scale and whatever you use for your area in the game, that your sound has a uniform sound. Because some people tend to use different levels of reverb for different things within a room, and it can be really off-putting. Sorry, am I standing too far?
That's fine, I can come.
So when you initially walk into a room, you're very close to the walls. When you stand in the middle of the room, you're the furthest point away. But your level of reverb will never change because the size of the room never changes, and that's what dictates the bounce rate, if you like, from your sound starting point to when you hear it again. If, for instance, you come into that room and you clap on your way in, and you can hear these noises as you come in, you can hear that distance between how big the room is and the sound that you're creating, a bit like sonar. And then somebody over here taps a keyboard, and that distance doesn't sound right. So they might be tapping their keyboard, and that level of reverb should be exactly the same as the clap that you had. So the time it takes for that keyboard noise to hit anyone's ears and your clap to hit anyone's ears, that reverb time should be exactly the same, because that dictates the size of your room. If you get that wrong, then it usually isn't off-putting unless it's somebody that's listening to it, but it can be if it's drastically wrong. So one of the things I was saying earlier about people using delay and reverb the wrong way around is often people will put a delay on something like a footstep because it gives a longer resonance after the initial sound has started. So a delay will do, I can't do a delay without showing you later, but a delay basically repeats it after a certain amount of time at a lower level. So if you're walking in and you've got a footstep and you have a delay on it, you'd stop walking and your footstep noise would carry on very, very slightly. And it can be useful depending on what you're doing. So if you want to create a canyon scene where you get natural echo anyway, delay is fine. However, that's probably the only point I can think of that we would ever use delay instead of reverb in a game, with the one possible exception of underwater in some kind of container. And that's as specific as it gets. because if you're using a delay anywhere else that it doesn't naturally occur, it will really throw you off. As a player, it will just not sound right, and you're then breaking your level of immersion. I can go on about that for a while, so I'm going to stop there and just quickly cover those, which I have already. Yeah, I've kind of gone along that already, so we'll skip that one. And this is probably the last one I'll do. Just, I know you guys have touched on Unity sound stuff, or rather, I know the second years have. I don't know if the first years have, and I know we didn't. But when you're splitting up your audio for your game scene, Unity's got a great little mixing tool now, which it never used to have. And I'll go through it on here. Actually, it's probably the easiest to do it. So when you're creating your initial sounds in Unity, you get your mixer channels. If anyone looked at the mixer channels in Unity?
A little bit.
Alright, so when you first bring a sound in and you open up your mixing channel, you get one master channel. And the way Unity handles it is it puts every single one of your samples into that master channel. So you can change the volume, pretty much, of every single sample in your game from that one fader, which can be really, really useful. But usually you want to break stuff down a little bit more than that. So what you actually end up doing is you would have, Unity doesn't look like this. This is just the easiest way to show you. You would actually have this as your master channel, which would hold no sounds whatsoever, which sounds weird, but bear with me. You would then assign every single one of your audio clips to a single channel on its own and make that feed into the master channel. Because what you've got control over is you've got the individual volume of every single sample in your game with an overall volume for everything that they can hear. So if you think that your theme tune is too loud and your effects need to be turned up, then what you can do is individually you can go through and turn every single one of your effects up, turn your music down without ever affecting the overall game volume, because your game volume will stay the same. Your master volume hasn't changed. So you can balance every single sound within your scene without worrying about your entire game being too quiet or too loud in some cases. You can take that a step further, because Unity's now got something called grouping. So what you could do is, after you split everything down into single samples, you then change them all into groups. So you've got your character effects, you've got room effects, and you've got your in-game audio, your background track or whatever you want to call it, in separate groups. So then you haven't got to worry about each individual channel for each section. You've then just got 3 faders that you can change the volumes of each bit for. Those would be those ones. I hope that's kind of helpful for Unity stuff, but I often find it easier to visualize what you're going to do before you do it. Because if you're bringing in a lot of sounds, which a lot of games usually do, there's rarely just a theme tune, there's always going to be some kind of effect, regardless of the game that you're making, whether it's a jump animation sound or, I don't know, you've got a pickup or something like that. There'll always be some kind of effect that you need to balance to your soundtrack. So when you're creating your soundtrack, just make sure that you're keeping everything as separate as you can, because that balance is really important. As I was saying way back at the start, be really wary of narration and effects and things like that, because they will resonate over other sounds and they will drown each other out. One really, really common one that I came across a couple of years ago was I was recording a voice actor doing his piece for, I think it was just a radio host thing. He was just doing his piece of voice acting. It wasn't the Archers, but it was something along those lines. And he recorded his piece, which was lovely, and completely failed to tell me that the actual scene was that it was in was based in an old Victorian house. So I recorded his voice in a very clear, crisp, environment, so that they had a very clear, crisp sound to work with. And then they put that straight into this scene that they created with all of their Victorian sound effects for their house, because it was a radio talk show, you didn't see anything. And it sounded terrible, because all of the effects they were using were quite low, there were things like wood creaks, which have got very, very subby tones as well as the high creak that you hear. They had things like rattling shutters, all of which were pretty much across this poor guy's voice register. So you were listening to this scene, and regardless of how low or high or whatever he was saying, you could barely hear him because all of the sounds in the scene were basically on the same level of sound, or the same frequency. So it's, again, really important to have individual control over each one of those things. Because if for whatever reason the guy that's working on your audio for your game doesn't have all of those pieces involved, you've still at least got some margin of control over the level of things that you feel important in that scene. So even if the effects do cut over the narration, that's fine. You're just going to have to live with the fact that you need to turn your game audio down, you need to turn the effects down, you need to bring the narration up, just to give it that little bit more clarity. There are a few things that we can do with EQ, which, have you come across EQ before? Okay, so EQ is the level of sound. I'll get my audio program up when this is finished and I can go through all of this in more detail. But EQ is basically your control over low noises, mid noises and high noises. Usually returned to its frequency, but noise is easy to understand. So you can turn up the bass effect, for instance. So they like your bass and treble controls for an MP3 player or stereo or whatever. That's effectively EQ. EQ, usually you have a few more options than just bass and treble, but it's essentially exactly the same thing. Just the frequencies of things like the effects, but generally if you're tweaking anything like that, it will mess with the atmosphere of the game, because any adaptation to audio will forever change the sound of everything else in that pitch. So if you're making the narrator's voice a slightly higher pitch because it's overlaying one of your effects, you'll then need to bring every single one of your effects registers frequencies down a little bit. You can't do it for just the one, because otherwise it will stand out and it will be obvious that your effects were too sparse, or you'll break the immersion for that scene because they might sound like they're a little bit off. And again, the same with the music. Music is much harder because it's a very complex sound, but if you're turning down the music because your effects or your narration are clashing with it, you need to be very careful that you're turning down the right tones. And in fact, I will probably finish up there because I keep saying I'm going to get out, so I really should have already read that.